got me unscripted. Yeah. I apologize. I'm not a voting person unless we're at a ball and someone brings tables. I'm more to walk around. But first of all, I want to say thank you to AUSA, not just for this event, but for all the great things that the association does. And it's a voice for the United States Army in many cases where we cannot be. And I can't say the power of this organization, especially the representation of kids at 1 point, soon to be 1.1. So, that's right. I have to remind everybody that we're getting bigger. Not big enough yet, but it's coming. And so thank you. I know General Hammond cannot be here. And my battle buddy, Ken Preston, I was not here today, but it's been my day. Not on yet? Just one. Oh, there we go. That's a whole different phenomenon right there. Wow. Do I need to repeat everything I just said? Or okay, great. That's great. So I know you're having great discussions, and I apologize. I was originally supposed to be here in the morning to help kind of set the strategic setting around this conversation. I know you had some great conversations today, and I probably will contradict half of them because I wasn't here. And that's just the way it works. But I was up on the Hill this morning with the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, and they had some congressional engagements to actually get some things done for our great soldiers. And as you can imagine, our focus of discussions this morning with one of the delegations that was up there and members, and most of the time is about readiness. And why am I bringing that up now? If you're talking about installations for the future, you cannot have any conversation in the Army today without first having conversation about readiness. Right? And when you focus on anything, we have to start with the word readiness. And there's a reason why. You can't have the word readiness or anything else without talking about the resource constraints of which we are under and have been under for several years. So the question I know that a lot of people have been posing today is, what will our installations look like and need, and what will our soldiers need in the year 2035? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm a graduate of Pennsylvania high schools, but that's only 18 years from now for my math. Did I get that right? I think I got that right, about right, which isn't too far off. I mean, this is not too far in the distance. And if you talk about a palm cycle, that takes 5 years out of that distance. So I could tell you what it's going to look like for the near future. And it's not going to be based wholly upon our requirements. I think that's actually the easier discussion to have. We know some of our near-peer capabilities. We know that our installations need to be power projection platforms. And we know a lot of the shortcomings that our installations have today. But the conversation about what our installations are going to look like in the year 25 have to start with what are our resourcing requirements in order to get us to some of the things that we've identified that we need. Because that's the environment we've lived under for the last 10 years. And for the foreseeable future, I can assure you, that's still going to be somewhat of the same environment. The Army is getting bigger, and that comes at a cost. Okay? It's good. We need to do that to fulfill our sustaining requirements, and that's what's going to drive the things that we need on our installations. But it also comes at a monetary cost, and we're going to have to make risk decisions based upon those costs. The same decisions we've been making for the last several years. And a lot of those, unfortunately, affect what goes on in our installations and the services we can provide associated with that. So when I got asked the question to come talk to you about, so what are soldiers going to need in the year 2035, and what are they saying now they need on our installations? Well, it really depends on the audience you talk about. You have our soldiers and our families. A soldier's a little bit different. And the way to describe, depends whether they're married or not. But let's talk with the soldiers and families first. So the big three, I actually went back about 2 years from every single town hall that I did on an installation for the last 24 months. So this is directly from the mouths of soldiers and family members. So the number one thing, which is actually the most utilized family program, is child care. Okay? So that is the number one thing. Is actually, we spend more money on child care than we do any family support program on our installations. And I won't get too far in discussion, but I'll just oppose some thoughts with you. Is we've created, I think, what is I consider world-class child care. When I was prepping for testimony, I said gold standard, and I was told, don't say that on the Hill, Sergeant Major, don't say gold standard, because then we will be expected to maintain that. And that's part of the discussion I want to have with you, is we've gotten to that gold standard. And not just child care, but some of the other services provide. We have to have the adult conversation of, are we sustainable from a resource perspective first? Okay. Now, this guy's the first one that'll be up on the Hill or anywhere else fighting for soldiers' benefits, but it's a reality discussion. We have had to take several risk decisions with regards to services in our installations and investment for future programs to invest in infrastructure and everything else on our installations based upon the offset for readiness. We're going to have that conversation in the future. So number one, world-class standards of which we created, are they sustainable from a services perspective? The number two thing that soldiers and families ask for is health care. What's the next biggest bill? Well, probably not the next biggest bill. That's one of the biggest bills we have, is the services that we provide. And we're already seeing challenges with the capability for us to be able to provide access to care, access to special needs care for our soldiers and families, because the expectation is growing, all right? As the requirements increase from a fiscal responsibility, as they get more expensive, our families are asking for more, okay? And this isn't anything about deciding on what is best between a soldier and a family of readiness, but when you only have a certain amount of fiscal requirement to be able to fill all those, and neither one, all right, can afford to take risk, we're going to have to make risk decisions, or we're going to have to make future decisions that make us sustainable for the future. We're seeing that we have to make decisions like that right now that are already setting us in place for what we're going to have. And the third and the final thing actually differs based upon the population. If you talk to soldiers, okay, it's barracks and single soldier facilities. We've also had to take significant risk in those areas right now. And if you talk to families, the third biggest issue that in the last 24 months they proposed is actually spouse employment. Okay? So we have a growing number of young spouses. The majority of our enlisted spouses, 61% of our population is married. The majority of our enlisted spouses do work. And because of the turbulence that we provide, just by the basis of how we move soldiers, as you all well know, is not conducive to their employment environment. And they want what every other American family wants. They want the American dream. They want the new cars, and they want those things. And they see that, and it takes them to both work to do that, which automatically, when they work, that increases our need for child care. It increases the load on our services, and increases demand. But the expectation now has come to the point where families expect us to help them get employment as we move them throughout, and that's okay. But really the basis of my discussion is I think we have to have a discussion of what do we provide on installations. We have to make a decision as what is sustainable for the future and our fiscal restraints that we know we're going to be in, at least for the foreseeable future. And how do we manage the risk of lowering the morale of our soldiers and families based upon what we can provide as services and capabilities and infrastructure on our installations with that of the risk of the need to provide the readiness requirements for the global environment in which we fight in. That's the discussion we need to have. And if anybody has the answer to that question, I can tell you what the installation is going to look like in 2035, okay? But what we're going to have to do is we will definitely have to continue to manage that risk, at least for the next 10 years. That's a no. As we grow the Army, the problem is not going to get away. It's actually going to get a little bit worse. And the reason is because of the requirements, all right, to pay, man, train, and equip each one of those soldiers that we bring in is going to compete with the enduring requirements of which we knew we already had. Okay? The Vice Chief Staff of the Army laid out for Congress this morning. I mean, so we have the Big Five, the platforms of which we designed in the 70s. We had the technological edge over our potential adversaries in the M1's Abram, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the Apache, the Black Hawk, and the Paladin. Okay? Well, that's 1970. That's some time ago. So these things are going to compete with things like reinvestment into technology in the future to maintain that technological edge. And all those things have to be worked into the services that we provide on the installations to maintain them and to train our soldiers. Providing the capability of a true power projection platform at our installations for the future by giving constructive live and virtual training in order to make them able to be able to accomplish their mission without the expenses of moving them all over the U.S. to do secondary training missions, maybe possibly in the future without the CTCs. Not saying we're not going to use them, but we got to be able to produce true power projection from each one of our installations, and that's going to come at a great cost. Our soldiers ask for a lot of things, and they should. They demand a lot of things. They demand excellence in services as which we should provide. But if we look back in the last several years, I think what we try to do is provide excellence in everything. And we take a look at some of the things that we utilize and how much we utilize a lot of the services on our installation. I think it's time that we need to give full flexibility to our commanders and installations to make the decisions on what they need based upon their geographic location. So I think we're trying to service too much in a domain that is too large, and it's unsustainable. It's unsustainable because we're going to have to continue to make decisions on what we resource. And it goes back to my opening statement. You can't do anything until you resource readiness first. It's going to have to be our number one priority. And you can tie everything to readiness. It's easy to do that. You can say, hey, this builds readiness. CDCs build readiness. And they do. You know, child development centers and after-school programs build readiness. They sure do. Barracks build readiness. All those things build readiness. But at the end of the day, a soldier's got to be what we're for. and General Perkins will use it very eloquently all the time, is we have to remember, what are we for? What are installations for? Well, they're for enabling soldiers to fight and win. That's what they're for. And we have to get back to, I think, asking ourselves is, what do we have to do to meet the minimum requirement to give our soldiers and families a life commensurate to what they should have as members of this service, and still provide our soldiers with the necessary resources to be able to fight and win in the battlefield in the future. Cool? Okay. So, what I'd like to do is, instead of, I'm pretty good at talking for like 2 or 3 hours. I don't want to do that. I'd like to entertain your questions. They don't have to be solely focused on this. I know you've entertained this topic all day today. I know there were some great discussions, everything from energy and resourcing for the future. But I also say I don't limit you to any discussions solely focused on installations. If you have any questions for me, I'll take them. Yes, sir.
Hi, Sergeant Major. It's Colonel Tom Netzel. I'm the guy that has to program this stuff for the XM. And one of the problems that we're facing right now as a programmer, with the thought that you just gave, like commanders decide what they want on the installation is, I'm building a program in 19. The commander that's decided in 17 won't be the commander in 19.
That's right. And
if the new commander comes in and he wants that service back, the issue is you can't get it back because you got rid of the FTEs and you got rid of the capability. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the issues I think we face on the staff is when you make a decision, it's hard to grow a capability back if you let it go.
Yeah.
So it has to be kind of deliberate. Yeah. And so the senior commander is very important in the discussion, but it needs to be very deliberate at a high level because we may get rid of a capability we would like to grow back.
And that's a great question, a great discussion. And I'll tell you, and I've seen it, I call it the good idea person. There's a great idea, and when a new commander and a green suitor comes in, we have another great idea, and there's another great idea, and next thing you know, you have about 80, 90 great ideas you can't afford, and about 70% of them don't get used. But you're right. So how do we maintain flexibility? I think we have to have the honest discussion on what is the baseline of support we need to provide our soldiers, and we have to level expectations with our soldiers and family members, okay? Because, again, I'm the first guy that's going to go say we need everything for them. But I'm also a realist because I have to sit in the same meetings with the chief, which I'm about to go to in a few minutes. Is called the SRU, all right, the Readiness Update. And I know the realistic costs it take to train and ready soldiers to fight and win. But I think we haven't done a good job of that as a service. I don't think we've managed expectations of what quality service is, the threshold of what quality service is in our installations. And I don't blame our soldiers and families for doing this, but we can't continue to increase that. It's unsustainable. We can't continue. It is unsustainable. Just like we know for right now that healthcare costs for the future are unsustainable, not just for the Army, but for the nation. So, and that's what they're working on the Hill today, and you see it on the CNN flash. It's going to cover these things. Is everybody okay with that? And then we have to draw that baseline. We have to have that discussion. So what is the baseline of services? And that also helps expectation of a family when they PCS from one installation to another. They know what the Army is going to provide me and what level of care is going to be provided those installations. And then we need to have that flexibility because there are differences in geographic locations. The national training centers are much different than the Fort Carson, Colorado's, and they're much different than, the Fort Bliss, Texas's. But I think a baseline of services, we took an attempt at that. We took a look at all the services and tried to put them into 3 buckets, high, medium, and low risk. It's too much. It costs too much to sustain all those. So I think we have to have that honest discussion. What is the baseline of services we provide our soldiers? And they have to be at a quality level that's commensurate to the quality of soldier that we expect to be able to retain. So we do got to provide them with the best care possible. We can't provide them with all the care possible. Yes.
Sorry, T.W. Williams.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of work went to actually defining common levels of service. So I don't know when you say that we got to do that. Hopefully we have not gotten away from it. I know exactly, and a lot of the other folks that came up with these common levels
Mm-hmm.
of service and how to define that, the number of services that was, and the ability to cost that to go to Congress to actually tell them exactly what the cost was going to be to run our installations. Are we not still?
Well, I agree there's a baseline. I know that we worked up a cost of, regardless of how many people are at the installation, this is what it costs to run an installation, the baseline of cost from a programming perspective. But I think if you asked a family member that there is no common understanding of what services are provided. You know, what is the limit of hours that we will run our CDCs? Would everybody agree they can't run 24 hours a day?
Oh, Sergeant Major?
It's what? Yeah, does it run 24 hours a day now? Yeah. So, but it'd be tough to continue to sustain that across the entire Army. And that's probably a great idea of a geographic location where we go outside. The commander has to make a decision. And that, again, that decision is going to be competing against, in reality, it's going to be competing against another requirement. But if you asked a family what is the baseline of the service that we provide as an Army, I'm not sure it's commonly understood. I know that we've worked a lot on building common basis of understanding, but I don't think we've managed expectations across the force, and families truly do know what the common understanding of service is.
Sergeant Major?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, Patty Barron with,
Hi, ma'am. How are you?
It's good to see you. You hit the nail on the head. Families don't know what to expect across the board, and I think that's extremely important. I'm an Army spouse of 30 years. I always wanted my soldier to go to war fully equipped and fully trained so that he could come back to me. I would venture that any family member in your Army, in our Army, feels the same way. The challenge is, of course, that there are other things that we have to contend with. You mentioned them: childcare, health care, spouse employment, all of those things we in this room that are spouses have had to deal with ourselves. But there isn't a clear message on what to expect. And even across the 3 buckets that you mentioned, I would venture to say that most people in this room don't even know what those 3 buckets are. What are you talking about when you're talking about the 3 different types of installations?
The medium, low, and high risk.
Exactly. Or the different types of installation, training, you know, deployable, and I think, and I don't even know the 3rd one, and that's probably a bad on me. Yeah. There's a question and an ask. The question is, how can we make that messaging from the Army to that family member so clear that they understand? Because if you tell a spouse, look, it's between this and this, I'm going to go here. I want that soldier to be safe. So I think we have to do a better job with that. And how can we at AUSA, I am your biggest cheerleader, let me tell you. I'm probably a bigger cheerleader to Holly than I am to you, but that's okay, you know. But I want to help the Army tell that story to our family members. So how can we help you get that message across, and how do we do it? And then just making sure that the basics, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, every time you move, you're down at the very basic level. Make sure that those basics are there for the majority of the families, and then our critical families get a little bit more. And
then what are the basics? I agree. So how do we do that? I think we have to have the very frank discussions. Okay. Again, I'm the huge advocate for the soldier, but I also am the person. When I go up to the Hill, I have the responsibility to fight for pay and compensation. It's one of the things the boss relies heavily on me personally to do that. And we're getting ready to have that conversation again for this FY. And when I go out and talk and do town halls with soldiers and families, I remind them that we can fund everything that you want. And there's a lot of passion for a lot of those things. And that's what drives the requirement sometimes, is the passion. And we get directed to do things that come at great cost. I remind them that money's coming from somewhere, and it might come out of your pay. It could come out of this. We will not sacrifice readiness. We can't. We cannot do that. We got to continue to modernize. We got to continue to invest for the future. We got to fill the gaps that we know that exist against current near peers, let alone 2035. So you do have to have that very open and honest conversation, because there has to be a limit of care. I mean, I get some requests from individuals that I'll just share with you. So again, I'm not saying that we should stop anything for our soldiers. I want to be the first one to say, oh, Sergeant Major don't want to have any care for our soldiers. That's not it. But I get questions like, why can't we have open tuition assistance for spouses and for children? Why is there a limit on tuition assistance? Why don't we all get it? Why isn't it all free? We have to manage that expectation in our force. Why isn't the CDCs open at 4 o'clock? Why do they close at 5? Why can't I keep my children there till 10 or 11 or 12? Well, you got to see them every once in a while, ma'am. So you got. But we have to have that discussion, and we also want to provide the best care we possibly can to our soldiers. But we can't risk one for the other. We have to make, and we're doing it right now. To be very frank with you, we've risked our installations through infrastructure support, through SRM, to make sure that we have the dollars to maintain them. We're only funding 95% of the critical requirement right now. That doesn't meet it. I've taken risk in soldiers' barracks. I testified just 2 weeks ago that I was embarrassed at the state of some of our barracks that our soldiers are living in Fort Bliss, Texas. We haven't put the money into them. We've had to assume that risk. And how far are we away from a Fort Bragg incident? So I think we need to have that conversation. I think we have to make some decisions. I think we have to assume that people aren't going to be happy with it. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that we're making decisions that is the good care that we need to provide our soldiers and family, the sustainable care that we can manage over time that is affordable and feasible within a budget that allows us to do what we're for, and that is fight and win our nation's wars. We have to have that conversation, because what we're doing is we're having the onesies and twosies as they pop up, and we're not meeting our requirements. We're not. We're not meeting the requirements across the enterprise. It's too large. We got to have that conversation too. How big does our installation footprint need to be? What is the cost we assume, whether one person lives on the installation or 150,000? There's not much of a difference in some cases for some services. But if we don't, we're not going to end our problem. So what is the level of care? I think we've added, and I'll defer to the experts, we've probably added more family programs in the last 10 years than we have in the last 80 or 90. What? Huh? Right? Not Adam, but yeah. Yeah. They stay sustaining to the standard. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. So it's the easiest conversation to have with anybody is, so I give you a pay raise, and now we decide I can't afford that pay raise for the endurable future. Would you take a pay cut? It's hard to have that conversation. We don't want to have that conversation. What we want to do is manage expectations and deliver a common level of service that's commensurate to the sustainability of the organization. Mr. Senator, you see that's right. And it's a tough discussion. It really is. Yes. They do. That's right.
That now there are expectations of being provided on your installation. And I think Bill Armstrong's a great thing. And when we talk about it, it's got to be in accordance with statute, policy, and I think most recently you said standard as well. Yep. But when we do that, then the expectation of each service looking alike sort of goes away.
It goes away, yeah.
The garrison commander along with the senior commander sort of decides, well, what can I provide in a different manner? Yeah. And what do I need to maintain and provide myself?
Yeah, and I think what a question, and stemming back to you, sir, is how do we get away from the changing it every 2 or 3 years when the green suiters change out? And I always said I base it on utilization. If the program is not being used and it has not been used for a long extended period of time, it's probably not needed by that geographic location. That may not be a common across the entire footprint, but it is a good indication of whether or not that service is there. And what is the cost of that service to the user? I mean, how many users are we getting out of the dollars we put into that program? And it's tough. I mean, anytime you want to cut something, it's tough. And I'm not an advocate of cutting anything. I am an advocate of doing things smarter. So I'll throw something out there that's probably going to be completely contentious, and there's probably about at least 10 people in the room that get mad at me about it. But we have successfully failed at taking care of barracks in the Army for 241 years. For those of you that are not history buffs, that's how long the Army's been around. We are not good at it. I mean, so we are not. We're not. We spend a lot of money on maintaining barracks because we're just not good at taking care of them, which is not surprising. I mean, we destroy things, so we shouldn't be in that business. I firmly believe that. We've demonstrated huge success. We've provided quality of delivery of housing by privatization. And other services has demonstrated success in this. And I think that's an area that we have to come up with creative solutions like that, look at things and say, is this a better way to deliver maybe even better services in the future by doing public-private partnership? And that there may be some solutions to some of that too as well. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I was just going to say, I've seen the 3 bucket list.
Yeah.
I'm the programmer. When I go through the 3 bucket list, the stuff that's most important to the Army uses 95% of the money. So if you grease well, get rid of that 3rd bucket. But that 3rd bucket's like $5 million of $1 billion.
That's a problem. Yeah.
So unless somebody changes delivery method or what the service level is, you really can't get at the cost.
Yeah.
And I was a garrison commander. Somebody walked into a CPC, and you mentioned the gold standard. It's at a standard that's higher
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So you've talked about, Olivia Smith, I'm with Accenture Federal Services. You talked about childcare, you've talked about spouse employment, meeting expectations, over delivery. Question is really about, Secretary Mattis has said, how can we build synergies across the department? How can we
Yeah.
build synergies in programs that are similar? All 4 services have childcare. All 4 services do tuition assistance. All 4 services do spouse employment. All 4 services have some form of family support program.
Yeah.
What's the Army looking like as we move forward into the next 4 to 8, 20 years of how you build those synergies in services that are they're common, but yet we've built separate infrastructures within each service to provide?
Yeah. And I won't speak for Secretary Mattis, obviously, that's not my place, but I do know exactly the conversation he's had, and we've had similar conversations in small group setting. And I believe he's right, and I think there's ability for us to do this. The culture of our services is the barrier to it, and that's really the only barrier, and I honestly believe that. I think that we spend an enormous amount of money and resources trying to replicate services across all 4 services. And it's... Yeah. Yeah. And what I think you'll see in the coming years is that I think Secretary Mattis will lead us in that direction. I think it's the right way to go for many things. Obviously, there's some things that are specific to the nature of each service, and that's okay. But largely, though, overhead is probably one of the things that we can work on across. I'm sorry? Oh, no, I agree with you. Yeah. Yeah. But delivery of services and goods from a maintenance perspective is completely different. Yeah, from that of the Air Force or the Navy or something like that. So you're right. Your common soldier family support systems are probably, and I'll tell you, their other services do it better based upon the distribution of money. And it's not that. It's not the fault of the Army. It's the scale of what we have to do it. It's the number of installations and the services we provide, and the nature of what we do in the DoD force. So we're the premier ground force, but we're also the logistics hub for DoD. So we have to have all of our services spread out through multiple locations. And a lot of people, we call it pay to play. We're not getting paid by the other services for the amount of stuff they're doing on our installations or the services we provide to them. Yeah, so they benefit from it. So that's the unique challenge of the United States Army being across 140. What's the total number now of installations we have? 140 something, 145. Yeah. And with a baseline fixed cost of $30 million in installation, you can just add the number. That's just the baseline cost of $30 million to run an installation. But I agree with you, man. I think there's plenty of opportunity there. I think the barrier to that is just service culture. I've seen it when I was on installations where we were directed through BRAC to combine, and a lot of the friction had nothing to do with anything but, we want to give up our culture of the Army versus, and I think we have to get beyond that and find ways. I can tell you right now, if you look at even today's resource requirements, and I hope they get better, but I also am cognizant of the fact of the fiscal restraints that our nation is in. So if you're asking for more money, where's it going to come from? And we have to get more fiscally responsible. And I think we can do it. I think there's plenty of room for us to do it. But we also have to manage expectations with our young men and women, which in the end may result in better care anyway. More money is not always the solution, because I can tell you right now, there is no more. There is no more. It's all being borrowed for something. And when you take something off the top line at my level, it's just the top line. So it's coming from somewhere else. And as the vice chief said this morning, if we don't get the UFR we need for this year, we stop training in mid-July, because we're already spent money for the end of the year that we were counting on, that we would get by growing the Army through the authorization we got last year, but the appropriation was not along with it. Yes.
I'm thinking for that, in terms of how you make the argument. You talk about readiness, not negotiable readiness. I think I would find that number associated with that readiness, I would call the minimum the number you will not go past, right? And so I don't believe that we've ever decided that for the installation stuff. We got the 3 buckets. We've talked about it a lot. MCOM's kind of put it out there. It said this is what we've come up with. But the Army, the way they have done it in Readiness, has not put that minimal acceptable line for each of these programs. Because if you did that, then it seems to me the way we argue for Readiness, we could argue for the installations too. So I'm making a comment here. Sorry, it's not a question, but it's probably to your point of the frank discussion. You got to have the frank discussion. And I believe from my 35 years that the service members, once you tell them that's what they're going to get, then they're going to be resilient and they're going to accept it, or they're not. I mean,
that's right.
Because if they don't, then they'll walk, they'll talk with their feet, right? So you got to take that risk, but you got to let them know what it is.
I agree.
You got to let them know what it is.
Yeah.
And then I think we can make an argument for more money as we need it. So just a comment. Sorry, I was
and I agree with you 100%. And this is the problem that we have. Well, first of all, I'm not blaming anybody for any of this because we've had an unpredictable budget environment for the last several years. Okay, and we're under sequestration and the Budget Control Act, so it is very difficult. And just to manage the budget and a 5-year programming and a 1-year execution in itself, if the programmers are in the room, they'll tell you the frustration of that every single day. That's the environment which we live in. And I don't see it getting, to be very frank with you, any better any soon. I mean, I think we'll just raise the ceiling. That'll be the short-term fix, but we're not going to offset $19 trillion of debt tomorrow. It's not going to happen. We're going to be under fiscal constraints, and our budget's going to be managed. And we're going to have to make decisions, and we're going to have to assume risk. I'm just being very forthright with you. And we have to manage expectations as we assume those risks, and we have to communicate it clearly to our soldiers and family, because the risk of doing that without communicating it clearly becomes that morale and those other things. Most times, if you are very forthright and honest with young men and women and their families, they're very accepting of it. But we also have to have the intestinal fortitude, because we're afraid to do it sometimes, to say, I know that you need that, but I'm sorry, but we're just not going to provide it. That's not a conversation we've had the last 15 years. All right, we've tried to say yes, because just as recently as the MCOM commander tried to say, hey, we're going to cut some services. Whoa, mackerel, no, we're not. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we didn't get any more money when that decision was turned off. All right, we didn't. All right, so like I said, it has to come from somewhere. Yes, sir.
Sergeant Major Richard Kidd on the Secretariat. Thanks for coming today. Really appreciate it.
Yes,
and I am no relationship to one of your predecessors.
SMA Kidd? No?
I can tell you some entertaining stories where Second Lieutenant Kidd crossed paths with Sergeant Major Kidd. Lieutenant came out at the lower end of that. But anyway, a quick question about expectations from our young soldiers versus folks who've been in a little bit longer. Do you see any change from our new entrants, lieutenants and privates and specialists who've grown up, in the interconnected world with how they want services, what types of services, how they want them delivered, how they want to live, how they want to spend their after-hours time?
Yeah, thanks. Absolutely, sir. And that's a great question. So I think there's a misperception of the millennials. I'm going to be very forthright with you, and that is largely because of our blindness. And I was having a discussion just before this. If you go back and look in history, the word teenager was actually developed in the 1930s. And I'm getting to a point. I'm just a history person, and the Army paid for my degree, and you're going to hear some of it now. So, so it was actually developed in the 1920s and 30s. And actually at that time, what's that, sir?
I got to look at math. Wouldn't have to hear that.
That's right. But at that time, it was so bad, at least from the perception of the elders, that America was going to fail after the generation that came in the roaring 20s and went through the Depression. And these kids, how dare they run around and talk about rock and roll and smoking cigarettes and doing all this stuff. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's the greatest generation in the world. That was the people that grew up, fought World War II, won, and started the Industrial Revolution and rebuilt America. And most of the things you have in the city today are all still as a result of that same generation that was the teenager. That's happening now. I can tell you the young men and women we have today, very intelligent. I think a lot of the mistakes that we're suffering from is because we can't tell them what right looks like and how to manage their expectations. Because we have set the tone of there is an unlimited level of care. Yes, we'll entertain that. And that's somewhat our fault. That's our fault. It's happened with healthcare. It's happened with our non-deployables. It's a big reason, and this is a discussion we want to have publicly, but I'm fine with having it. We have too many non-deployables in the Army because we established a culture that it was okay to be sick. No, better than that. We compensated you more for the more sick you were. Now, we did that out of good reason, to compensate our wounded warriors and to not lose faith with the American people that we lost in the previous war. But unfortunately, it creates an environment and a culture that it's okay and it's accepting, and you don't have to deploy. Oh, no, yes, you do. We're here to fight and win, and people get hurt as a result of it. And we have to change that dynamic, because over 100,000 non-deployables, that's unsustainable as well. So it's just the conversation we have. I think that they're very capable. They are very, the ones that we're getting in basic training today, their absorption rate, their attention span is, I think, 7 times less, but their absorption rate is like 5 times more than we were kids. They can absorb information 5 times faster than you when you were a child, because they've been exposed to the world's information within a nanosecond, held in their hands since the day they were born. So they are bored easily by our techniques. You know, they very much so. If I put a traditional PowerPoint slide up to young kids in basic training today, and there's 3 points on it, we would talk about that for 3 hours. They'd be like, next slide, let's go. I read those 3 words. Come on. You know? And I think that we have to be very forthright with them. Set the expectation of level of care. What is it? Because I don't think they know, and I think that's our responsibility. I think we've set the conditions for what we're in, and it's going to be our job to lead us through the transition of that and manage expectations. I think that's going to be our biggest problem for the future. But I don't see much difference in these young millennials. I think they're very competent. I think they're very capable, at least the ones we're getting in the United States Army. There is a reduced population of them. We know that. But they're doing quite well. If people often, the perception is they're less physically fit. It's untrue. When a soldier graduates basic training today, their PT scores higher and they have a less injury rate than the last 2 decades. That's true. I can show you all the data on it. Higher PT scores. They have higher weapons qualification scores. Oh, they can't shoot. They can't do all the stuff. They've been playing video games. Well, no, video games got them pretty nimble with the trigger, I can tell you that. Yeah. I just spoke at Fort Benning. Average PT score was something like 265 and 37 for qualification out of 40. Higher than they've ever been in the past. So there is some misconceptions. They are different. They're millennials. But they're no different than the teenagers in the 20s and 30s. And they, if presented with the challenge, ladies and gentlemen, they can be the next greatest generation. I'm confident of it. We just have to say, hey, here's the level of care that we can provide for you. So I hope I didn't cause too much consternation in the great conversation you had today. And I hope I didn't change your perception on me as an advocate for our young soldiers and their family members. I want everything that we can possibly give them. That was our job. It's what the Americans' job is give the next generation a little bit better chance at life than we've had. All right? But we can't give them too much. They're just like our children. We have to manage expectations, and we have to be sustainable for the future, because it's just as unfiscally responsible for us to do the latter. We've got to set conditions. We've got to set them, you know, we've got to have, can't give them Mercedes if they can't pay it off in the future. All right? Got to give them a nice Chevy pickup truck. That's what Mrs. Dailey said. I asked for a fully loaded F-150. She gave me a strip model Chevy, and she said, it'll get you to work, honey. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your time today, and thanks for all you do.